Hi there, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you here to Prog Monster. Sorry, my name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So we're here for Commonalities Compared, an episode we do Sunday nights at 8. And we're doing these two bands today, Deep Purple and Black Sabbath. Yeah. So basically what this show's about is Ben, who is a subscriber of mine, gives me a couple of common bands that have something in common with each other, or it could be albums, could be guitarists or bass players, or something to do with rock that's of commonality. And then I talk about them, and that's pretty much what it is about. So today he's given me two bands, obviously, two of the big three, I would call the three that came out in the early 70s that kind of dominated the hard scene. And we've got Deep Purple here. I chose Machine Head to represent them. And Volume 4 from Black Sabbath. So both these bands are bands that came out, of course, in the early 70s. Well, in the case of Deep Purple, it was the late 60s. And in actual fact, Black Sabbath, As Earth, came out in the 60s as well. So they were both around in that late 60s period. Deep Purple put out 3 albums prior to making that transition to a much heavier sound, where Black Sabbath was kind of a heavy band to begin with, right off the bat. Some people would say that these bands were both heavy metal, but I don't think of either of them as being heavy metal until much later. For Black Sabbath, probably in the 80s when they jumped to Heaven and Hell. Deep Purple, I think, maybe a little bit heavier, but I've never thought of Deep Purple as a heavy metal band. To me, they're a blistering hard rock blues band, which is to me the same thing that Black Sabbath is, a blistering hard rock blues band. Now, Deep Purple has a bigger element of keyboards than Black Sabbath does have some keyboards in their music, especially later, but early on, Deep Purple was dominant in that regards to the keyboard element of their music. Both have similar sounding vocalists, at least early on. Sabbath's Ozzy, Deep Purple's Ian Gillan, both having that kind of nasally, kind of high-pitched whine, I would call it. In the case of Ozzy, it is the only way you can understand him, because if he talks, you don't get it. But with Ian Gillan, his voice also perpetuated a high-pitched scream as well. I would call it a scream. He's a screamer, but not a screecher, which is a totally different element in music. I think his high-pitched scream is actually quite good. Some of the early stuff is predominant, but the time in which they both had Ian Gillan at one point, Ian Gillan taking over from Ronnie James Dio in Black Sabbath in the mid to early 80s as a vocalist there, maybe put on his best performance as a screamer on that album. His vocals were fantastic on the album. The album itself had a bit of a muddled sound to it, murky at best, but the vocals were fantastic. So they both have that heavy element to their music. Lots of catchy riffs. Both of them having two of the better guitar players in rock at the time, in Tony Iommi and Ritchie Blackmore. Both making absolute killer riffs. Deep Purple with their Smoke on the Water as iconic, and Black Sabbath with their Iron Man and Paranoid as well. Yeah, lots of heavy riffing from both bands. Some pretty dominant drummers too. Both drummers pretty strong in their drumming ability, I think. Both backing up and giving a spine to the bands. And of course, Roger Glover and Geezer Butler on bass, absolutely killer. I think Geezer, to me, is a little more predominant than Roger Glover, but no less important to the bands. Where in the case of Geezer doing quite a bit of the early lyrics, and some would say all of them, whereas Roger Glover did a lot of writing as well here too. Now I think it was Ian Gillan that did most of the writing, but later on I think Glover kind of took over a little bit from that. Anyways, this is a 5-man band primarily. This is a 4-man band, although Sabbath, when on tour, would often have a keyboardist as well. So pretty absolutely crushing. Both of these were headlining bands. Both were considered to be the front runners on any concert bill at most times. You get with Deep Purple, so you've got both of them having, of course, a color in their name: black for Black Sabbath, purple for Deep Purple. Yeah, and they were considered 2 of the big 3, along with Led Zeppelin, which would have been considered the other band. But these 2 were the 2 heavier of the 2 bands, although some people would argue that Led Zeppelin was heavier of the 2 bands. They're the one that coined the phrase heavy metal. I'm not going to argue with that. I just have always thought of these as being the 2 heavier of the 3 bands. Anyways, both put out albums regularly throughout the 80s. Both had changes to their lineup at times. Black Sabbath changing and adding Dio at one point, and then Gillan later, and some other people after that. Deep Purple going from their original band and adding Ian Gillan, and then dropping him in favor, or him leaving, and them picking up David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. Strong vocal performances by both these bands. Lots of classic hits too. Some of the most notarized songs in rock heavy metal history come from both of these bands. So personally, I'm a huge Sabbath fan. They are one of my group of 9 now. Have been one of my favorite bands almost since I first heard them with Heaven and Hell, and have remained at least in that group for the entire time that I've had them. Deep Purple's never quite made it to that range, and maybe they won't. I think it's the keyboards kind of sets them back a little bit for me. Loving lots of their stuff, but the keyboards tend to be a negative for me on the whole, even though their keyboardist is fantastic, and if you're going to have a keyboardist, you should have the best, and he's one of them. But I just never was drawn to heavy music with tons of keyboards. Even with Rainbow, which I also like quite a bit too, there was some heavy keyboards. That keyboards was a little bit different than this, but I still think of hard rock as being keyboardless, and so I've never really overcome that. So Deep Purple, although one of my favorite bands, not in that echelon with Black Sabbath. So there you have it. Those are the 2 bands for the commonalities today. Deep Purple, I think, has about 23 albums now. I could be wrong. Black Sabbath, I think they have around, maybe, I'm not quite sure. I think it's probably in the 15 to 20 range, somewhere in there. I never actually counted them. I could count them, but I'm not going to. But I think it's in the 15 to 20 range. But also, both of them have put out some excellent albums with some excellent songs. So there you have it today. I hope you liked it. Please like and subscribe. It's much appreciated. Don't forget to comment. How do you see these 2 bands? Am I way off on one of them? Am I right on? Am I way off on the other one? Maybe I'm off on both of them. That wouldn't be a problem. I could live with that. Please hit the notification bell as well. And we will see you next week for 2 commonalities compared.